Powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. Now, live from inside the Matt Black Kia Studios. This is Football at 4.
And Football at 4 is powered by the Inside the Birds podcast, and it is brought to you locally by PropSwap, America's sports betting marketplace. Sell your sports bet, take your profit. Find out how. Go to PropSwap.com. Download the PropSwap app today. Geoff Mosher from the Inside the Birds podcast is here on another edition of Football at 4. And boy, do we have plenty to talk about today. Geoff Mosher, what is going on? We just had a lively hour, a lot of good calls, a lot of good texts, with some very open-minded conversation. How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad you're having open-minded conversation. That doesn't happen a whole lot on airwaves and in cyberspace, so I'm glad to hear you, or at least are able to have
trying
some.
to anyway. I would say trying to.
Sure.
Obviously, big news with this Brian Flores suing the NFL. It's been all over. He spoke today. I mean, I'm pretty surprised that he was out there talking the next day right after. But listening to him here, heard him this morning on a couple different interviews. I feel like this is a guy who's truly hurt by this. Like, he understands he is in a situation where he has given up something that he loves. I think he realizes that he's probably not going to get an opportunity again, although we can get into that. I kind of want to start off by, you've probably read or saw the lawsuit. What stands out the most to you in all this? Is it the fact that he thinks there's discrimination in the hiring process? Is it the Stephen Ross stuff? I think the Denver stuff is a little bit more frivolous when compared to this, although he doesn't think it's frivolous. He's saying they showed up drunk to my interview, which is an indication they don't think I was a real candidate. So what really stands out at the height of all this to you?
Yeah, I don't think it's really one individual allegation. I think that what it shows to you, it takes you inside the mind of Brian Flores, and then you can contextualize it with what you've heard from some other African-American coaches who have come out and talked about their experiences. It's not just one thing that happens. I mean, here's, in Brian Flores' case, the third time in his professional career where he has felt that whether overt or inherent bias, racial bias, played a role in his career, going back to what happened in Denver, which by itself may seem a little, whether it's frivolous or just hard to even prove, either or. That's step one. Then what went on with the Dolphins being step two. And then, of course, recently with the Giants, step three. I know Marvin Lewis came out and made some comments about how he's felt during his career similarly. And I believe that you'll hear that from a lot of coaches or just anyone involved in the NFL who's a person of color, that there is just that intention of the NFL, that spoken intention by the league to try to do better. And the Rooney Rule and things like that, and whatever is put on the back of a helmet or in an end zone, their actions are one as far as saying it, and then doing it is another thing. And you're seeing other guys come out and talk about their experiences that they believe has really hurt them in their quest. And so I guess nothing individually surprises me. And I would say, the risk that he's taking as far as not coaching again is pretty fair. I mean, you see what happened to Colin Kaepernick for the stand that he took. So I do think, though, he's so young, and maybe he'll get an opportunity in the college. I don't know. It shouldn't have to come down to that. But I don't know that it's the last time he'll be able to coach football.
Well, he does still have 2 interviews that he is up for. I mean, he is up for the Houston job. He is up for the New Orleans job. And you wonder, how does this affect his candidacy in those positions?
You do wonder, especially with Houston, which has had, which we all kind of assume, and we talked about it on Monday, is such a difficult environment and not looked upon as a great destination for future head coaches, which is why that they may have to make an unconventional hire, be it, Jonathan Gannon or Josh McCown, somebody who hasn't had that experience before. Listen, they've had people talk about that front office and bias as well. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see if Flores does get that second interview and if he's seriously considered for the job.
There's so much, people look at the Rooney Rule, right? And you have some people who look at that Rooney Rule and say it's not fair that these guys are getting an interview if they don't even deserve the interview. They look at it from that aspect, as opposed to the way that Flores is looking at it is, I'm only getting the interview, and the interview process is supposed to be one that's fair, that I'm being interviewed because I'm really being considered for the job. That's where the disconnect is. A lot of times these guys are interviewing for a job that the team has no intention of ever offering them, regardless of how well they do in that interview. And then you have a group of people, we have people text today, oh, if anything, these guys have a better chance to get the job because they're automatically guaranteed a interview. So I guess the question is, like, the Rooney Rule, it's not serving the purpose that it was meant to because the teams aren't holding their end of the bargain. They're not giving good faith interviews.
Right. I think that is the more based on what we've seen. If you're going to do some kind of data or results out of it, you would see that that's the argument, is that none of the interviews are actually leading to an increase in hiring of coaches of color. So that it's not whoever's arguing that, someone is unfairly getting an opportunity to get a job, I think is on the short end and the wrong end of that argument, because we're seeing that guys who are qualified, it's not like you're seeing a ton of minority candidates get interviewed that you've never even heard of. I mean, in many cases, you're talking about coordinators, position coaches for good teams. So it has not worked. I think the biggest issue, and I'm certainly no expert on it, I'm just a guy with an opinion, is I think you can change rules and you can change policies, but you cannot change what is inherent within people, especially if people don't recognize it within their own selves. Like we talk about the word racism, but this isn't like, 1950s Jim Crow style racism where a person of color sits in a seat and the owner across the table is like, nah, I'm not hiring this dude because he's black, or nah, I'm not hiring this dude because he's of a different race. What it is, and again, my opinion is that you have older guys, mostly older white men, who, when they're looking to interview head coaches, they're thinking like, how do I relate to this person? I want to be charmed by this person. I want this person to feel like he has a connection to me because he's going to be the franchise face for me. And if you don't feel like you have a lot in common because racially you're so different and culturally you're so different, that's an inherent bias that a lot of these guys may not realize that exists, but that is equally powerful as just saying, I don't like this guy because he's of a certain race. Because if you're just sitting there saying, I want this guy to wow me, and he gives you great, interview and has great ideas, but at the end, you just didn't feel that comfort. Whereas if a person who was the same thing, you would feel that comfort because that's the guy you feel like you could go have a beer with because you were raised similarly, or you have similar backgrounds or similar culture. That's the issue. So you can change policy, but you can't change what's inside a lot of people and make them see something differently than they've seen all their life. And that's why I think the only way to resolve this issue is to have more black ownership and black general managers. And sometimes general managers don't do the hiring.
Well, and that's what I said earlier is, the owner thing is, I don't know how you change that. Obviously, you don't. If you own a team, chances are you're not in a rush to sell it, so you own that team. And I said, look what's going on with Jeffrey Lurie. Ultimately, he's probably going to pass it to his son. So it'll remain in that family until someone in that family decides they don't want to own a football team any longer. So that's one. Right. The other point that you just brought up, I brought up earlier, is the next step that maybe the league needs to start, targeting is to try to find ways to get black general managers so that the person that's directly involved with interviewing and helping make that decision has an influence on the owner. And then the pipeline of your tree starts to grow of this guy worked for me, because that's really how a lot of this happened, Geoff, is whenever this league started, and then you worked for a guy, and then you knew a guy, and then here we are. I mean, there's still people that work in this league from the Bill Walsh tree, for God's sakes. But I worked for you in 1988. We coached together with Bill Walsh. Oh, I know that guy. We coached together in San Francisco. Well, there's a huge generation gap of white guys who coached together in 1970, 80, 90, and African Americans that coached together. So It's almost like you have to get somebody in place of that has enough power to convince the person who makes the ultimate decision, hey,
I agree.
You can feel safe making this decision. This is the right guy to go with.
Yeah, and it's going to take more than one. And in a lot of cases, general managers, don't do the coach hiring. You know, a lot of cases you have a general manager, but ownership is still heavy. Like here with the Eagles, you know, Jeffrey Lurie hires the head coaches. Now, he may take Howie's input. He may get a list from Howie. Howie, of course, is part of the process. But at the end of the day, that decision is going to be made by Jeffrey Lurie. And so there are teams that have general managers of color. I mean, Minnesota, you just mentioned, has a black general manager.
Newly.
Detroit has a black general manager. I think that I mean, there was one in Rick Smith in Houston years ago. Was a black GM. There's others.
Cleveland.
Obviously, Jerry Reese. Yeah, Cleveland also.
Oddly enough, Miami.
Oddly enough, Miami does have an African-American general manager.
Now, it's funny that
a lot of these cases, it's the owner still making the hire.
Right, but
the head coach.
It's odd that I don't know that Flores is essentially saying that Ross was having racist or practices in his hiring. The allegation against Ross is a totally different animal, which was he offered me $100,000 to lose games on purpose, which is just absolute. Like, if you're Roger Goodell, don't you have to say that harms our league? You can't be here any longer.
Yeah, I mean, if that's true, that's a serious allegation, race regardless. I mean, that's just bad for the league, awful for the league, and obviously Roger Goodell would have to act on that, and the other owners would have to act on that if that were the case.
He says he has a class action suit here, which means he's hoping to get more people involved in this case. And I think he said, this morning that he's not the only one who felt this way. Somebody texted in earlier or called in too. And, this is with anything. Like, he's not wrong about what he said. Like, what if Belichick never sent the wrong text message? Would Flores be suing the league? And I say with everything, most times you don't apologize until you get caught. Flores may have had these thoughts, but had nothing to prove it. His proof became that he was interviewing for a job that had been predetermined, right? And that's where his fears and his thoughts were proven to him. So now I can act on it. So, do you think the NFL is in some serious hot water here, or do you think this is just something like a lot of things? They'll come up with an agreement and it'll kind of go away, and that there will be no impact from this, essentially?
I think the NFL could be in some hot water if more coaches, more African-American coaches, more coaches of color come out with their stories and have the ability to prove it via text or just somebody else who can corroborate. Obviously you should believe people's allegations, but in the court of law, you need evidence. And sometimes evidence can be very cloudy, like that text from Bill Belichick to Brian Flores. Is that a text that means he definitely heard from Buffalo people that Dable was getting the job?
Right, you would imagine that the league is
almost all but certain. Like, the Giants could come out and say, Dable was our guy, but we were going to give Brian Flores a chance to change our mind. So, there's some murkiness.
Right,
there.
You would think the league is now going to say to Belichick, well, who talked to you? Who did you talk to? Where did you get this information? What did they tell you that made you so sure that the Giants were making this hire, right? That would be the next step of where this needs to go, really.
Right. And then you'd have to find out, how much Bill Belichick is going to be willing to come forward and say out of this. Now, I've seen some interesting conspiracy theories that Bill purposely sent that text to Flores instead of Dable to try to, be a catalyst to all of this.
Those have been out there. Let me ask you, you talk to a lot of people in this league. Geoff Mosher, Inside the Birds. You've been covering the league for a while. You have plenty of sources. You know a lot of high-ranking people. Do you feel that these teams generally hire the best candidate? Or is it more, I know this guy, I feel comfortable with him, and that's why I'm hiring this guy?
No, I feel like all right, this is a broader conversation that goes beyond race, so I don't want to minimize the race issue.
I agree, because I think
that's an issue.
I think it's twofold here. It's well, I guess it's a fair question to say. Is it a racially generated decision or is it a comfort decision? I went to college with that guy. We worked together in Minnesota. I
don't even think it's that, Mike. I think it's a detached from reality. I did not, as you just mentioned, how many people inherit these ownership responsibilities from their parents? It's passed down to them. They don't know how to run a football franchise. Every time I see that an organization has to hire a search firm to figure out who the best coaching candidates are to be a head coach for their franchise, I laugh. I wonder what planet they live on that they would have to actually hire a search firm instead of the million of people that they've got in their own front office, instead of going to all their owners' events and combines and all these league events that happen, like 7 or 8 of them a year, and associating with people and getting an idea. Like, listen, who's the guy on NFL Network? Good Morning Football, Peter Schrager. He got in trouble for this because they made fun of him about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, but he was dead on. He was the Jets before they hired, I think it was Gaze, or maybe the general manager, maybe it was Douglas. They had a search firm, try to narrow down a list of good candidates for him. And Peter Schrager says, I've been a journalist covering this league for over a decade, almost 2, and I could come up with a list based on all the people I network with and source with that have really good coaching candidates. And, they made fun of him on New York Sports Radio for saying that. But the reality is, I think that that's fair and true. I think Adam Kaplan, I think myself, I think people who are dedicated their life to covering the league, to getting to know people, could at least produce for you a list of qualified coaches to say here. Yeah. If you're an NFL owner and you can't even come up with 8 people around the league that you're invested in, and figure out who you should bring in to interview, then you are so detached that you've got issues and you're hurting your franchise because of it.
I agree with that. I mean, I look at some of these lists and I'm thinking to myself, but some of them have to be based on relationship. Doug Peterson, for instance, was not on any team's radar. None. He happened to coach with Andy Reid. Andy coached in Philly. Like, that exists, right?
Yes.
But there's also the other element of it where somebody brought this up before, but, if you fire your coach and you have an opening, and Jim Harbaugh calls you and says, I'm interested in your job, or I want your job, essentially the other interviews are frivolous at that point, because now you have a guy that you predetermined has interest in me, which gives me interest in him. When Andy got fired, the Eagles wanted to hire Chip Kelly. Like, that's a guy that they sought out. So they didn't want to go through all these other interviews because they had a guy in mind. So I guess the question is that wrong of teams to have that? Like, because to me, that's almost like, you know what I'm saying? Like, your team's not where you want it to be. You want to kind of move on. And twofold. You want to move on. You fire your guy, and you have someone in mind that you're already interested in. You're not just firing someone with saying, I have no idea where I want to go with this. Mm-hmm. That is where I think there's a problem, too. That is, my team stinks, and I want to fix it, and I've been observing, and I like that guy there, and I think he can help my team.
Right. No, I don't think, obviously every situation, there's 32 teams, they all have different kind of processes, so I don't want to go through each one. But with the Eagles, it wasn't wrong because they had researched this. They had gotten to know Chip Kelly, how he had been out to Oregon many times as a front office exec, as a GM, and he had experience. There are plenty of guys that are connected to the Eagles whose children played for Chip Kelly. So they were able to understand. And then it would have been negligent of them to say, we're only going to interview Chip Kelly and maybe 2 other people. But they still, even wanting Chip Kelly, they cast a very wide net that year. They interviewed everybody under the sun. They interviewed like 3 college coaches that year. Brian Kelly was also involved. I thought Kevin Sumlin might have been on the list at the time. I don't remember, but they still interviewed a lot of people. And just this last time around, they hired Nick Sirianni, but they interviewed at least 8 to 10 guys. I interviewed a ton of guys. So they cast a wide net there, which is something I think you should do, not only to give yourself as many different perspectives, but also to get intel for down the road.
Hey, let me. We're short on time, so I don't want to cut you off,
Sure.
but I want to ask you a question because somebody just texted this in, and it's a good, interesting conversation. I think the NBA is all white owners except for Michael Jordan, right? To my knowledge, I think there's only one minority ownership group. Why do we think the NBA is more willing to give black head coaches their own team here, or GMs and coaches? So they have all white owners essentially in the NBA. You think it's interesting that they're a little bit more open-minded thinking group?
It's a good question. I'd have to kind of really sit down and think about it. My tendency right now is to want to say that NBA owners are probably a little bit more progressive-minded and liberal-minded than NFL owners, and that might play a role in it. But people don't like to say that, and I understand, because now you're saying, well, if you're not liberal, if you're a conservative, you're a racist. No, I'm not saying that at all. All right, I'm not.
Right.
But I am saying that the NBA has always been a little bit more forward and progressive and leaned in that direction, and that could be a reason why you see more African American coaches, along with the fact that the league itself is predominantly African American. I know so is the NFL, but the NBA is I would think even a little bit more. I don't know. I haven't seen numbers, but
yeah, I think the number Flores gave today for the NFL is 70% of the league.
Right. And what's the NBA?
I don't know, but it's an interesting text. I wanted to read it off. Before we run Inside the Birds, you just did an ITV TV with Rick Spielman, and I think there was a lot of good stuff in there. You asked him about Jalen Reagor. Obviously, Spielman's the guy who drafted Justin Jefferson. Do you feel he gave you a fair and honest answer, or did he give you a political answer?
No, I think he was fair because he went into each of the three receivers. He said they were all on the board there, Jefferson, Ayuk, and Reagor, and he went into what he liked about each of them. He went into some pretty good detail on the questions he had on all three of them. With Jefferson, there was some question about playing outside because he played slot his entire senior year.
Which was the big question about him going into the draft.
Right. With Ayuk, they noticed that he lined up always on the side that the coaching staff and Arizona State sideline was on, and they were giving him the plays. So there were some questions about his processing there, mental processing. And with Jalen, they liked that he was dynamic as a returner and a receiver, but I believe they had questions about just in general, like how many times was this a high volume receiver guy in the NFL? And so he went through and he said, and I asked him, I said, look, if the Eagles had taken Justin Jefferson, who would you have taken? And he said, we had both those guys there. They would have had to make a call on either Ayuk or Reagor. So,
well, I'm glad he said that because I'm glad he said that because there's been a lot of people who said the Eagles took Reagor and he was on nobody's board. He was a third round pick.
That's what we got out of this, is that anybody who thinks that Reagor was like a 5th round pick taken in the 1st round or a 3rd round pick taken is wrong. And we've said that on Inside the Birds a lot. It hasn't worked out, but he was slotted in that late 1st.
Now, he did say he's not ready to call him a bust.
Yes, he also said he's not ready to call Jalen Reagor a bust.
And what he did say was on draft day was they actually like Reagor. It almost sounded like more because you add in his ability as a return guy and that he thought that added extra value to him over the other two guys.
That's correct. So he said that. I don't think he's, angling for a job in the Eagles front office. The guy's been a GM for 30 years between Minnesota and
he's got an interview
Miami,
in Jacksonville, though, right?
He does have an interview in Jacksonville, so we'll see what happens there because that's kind of a weird situation. They already have a GM who's not very popular right now. So we'll see what happens there. But, I don't think he was saying that. If you listen to the entire interview, he's pretty honest about everything that had gone on in Minnesota.
Well, check out the interview with former Vikings general manager Rick Spielman. It's on the Inside the Birds YouTube channel, on the Inside the Birds TV, their latest edition of that, with Rick Spielman, the former Vikings GM. He talks a lot about the Reagor situation. So if you guys are all still want to know why that happened or what the Vikings were thinking, because there was the video of the Vikings laughing and like, oh, my God, we got the guy. That makes the perception seem that that's the guy they wanted, not Reagor or Ayuk.
Right. Although it is pretty standard when guys are up on the board and picking, they're pretty happy usually because they're getting somebody that they want, especially in the 1st round. So,
all right, Geoff Mosher, Inside the Birds podcast, InsideTheBirds.com. NFL, plenty. Super Bowl, obviously coming up. Also, free agency in about a month and a half from now, March 16th. And we'll be all over that with previews and more here on Football at 4. All right, Geoff, appreciate it, man.
Take care, Mike. Thanks.
Good conversation. Geoff Mosher from InsideTheBirds.com and the Inside the Birds podcast. I'm Mike Gill.